diligent and dedicated work to get this bill completed. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you tell us how much time remains for each
Gentleman
side?
from Washington has 9½ minutes remaining. Gentleman from California has 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. With that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Connecticut, member of the committee, Mr. Courtney.
Gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this bipartisan defense measure, which makes an emphatic commitment to America's undersea naval force. In the last 2 years, we have had the following: the National Security Review in 2011, the Quadrennial Defense Review, and the Nuclear Posture Review, and all of them have had the same consistent theme on this issue, which is that the U.S. Navy's preeminence in the undersea domain must not be neglected, and that sea-based deterrence is a critical insurance policy for our nation from any emerging nuclear force. With that in mind, this measure invests $5.9 billion in the Virginia-class submarine program. It will fund 2 submarines in 2014, advanced procurement in 2015, has $1 billion for the Ohio replacement design work, which is a best guarantee that we will have a cost-effective production of that critical vessel, and finally the Virginia payload module, which will increase the missile capacity of the Virginia-class submarines and allow, again, the Navy to replace the capability of the SSGN force, which is going to be going offline over the next 10 years. The Sea Power Subcommittee, led by my friend Mr. Forbes, has held a number of hearings which, again, have re-emphasized the critical need for this both in our Navy and our national security, and I urge a yes vote for this measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, our former chairman of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, who was recently moved from our committee to the Appropriations Committee, and she will be sorely missed. The gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Roby.
Gentlelady from Alabama is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to express my support for this National Defense Authorization Act. I want to express my gratitude to Chairman McKeon and the entire Armed Services staff for their hard work and commitment to our men and women in uniform. While I will no longer be serving on the Armed Services Committee, I know that Chairman McKeon and his team will continue their good work. Mr. Speaker, providing for the common defense is one of the fundamental duties of the Congress spelled out in our Constitution, and I'm proud to represent 2 distinguished military installations in Maxwell Gunter Air Force Base in Montgomery and Fort Rucker in the Wiregrass. These installations and others like them around the world will be better able to prepare our men and women thanks to this year's NDAA. One important part of this bill I want to highlight is its focus on helping our military assets respond to global threats while remaining within our nation's fiscal constraints. During my time as chairman of Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, we focused on the rights of Afghan women and ensuring that our military is better postured to respond to any future attack like the one on the consulate in Benghazi, Libya last September. I am pleased that the NDAA provides provisions offering the appropriate guidance on both of these issues. The bill also addresses the important issue of sexual assault in the military in a responsible and reasonable way, and I know my friend Representative Walorski is going to address that in a moment, and I appreciate her and others' leadership on that issue. I encourage my colleagues in the House to pass this critical measure to ensure that our military men and women receive the resources and policy that they need to do their job. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for your work, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, the ranking member of the Intelligence, Emerging Threats, and Capabilities Subcommittee.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 2 minutes.
As unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection. Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in strong support of the House Amendment to H.R. 3304, the National Defense Authorization Agreement for FY 2014. This legislation represents the best path forward for the work that we must do in order to support our men and women in uniform and our national security. And I applaud Chairman McKeon and Ranking Member Smith for their efforts to ensure that it is enacted. Now, I'm pleased that the bill continues the strong support of the Virginia-class submarine, Ohio replacement program, the Virginia payload module, all of which are critical to our future capabilities. I'm also pleased that this measure improves on several key aspects of the House-passed defense authorization, including a number of initiatives designed to confront sexual assault in our military, policies making progress towards the administration's goal of closing the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, and improved provisions relating to the nuclear weapons enterprise and missile defense. Now, I've been proud to work closely, in particular, with Chairman Mac Thornberry on the numerous provisions under the jurisdiction of the Subcommittee on Intelligence, Emerging Threats and Capabilities, where I'm proud to serve as ranking member. Now, we have prioritized resources for our Special Operations Forces and our cybersecurity efforts, as well as investments in advanced technology and research and development. While more clearly must be done by both DoD and the whole of government to address the challenges also that our nation faces in cyberspace, there are many positive steps as well in this legislation, including incentivizing new cybersecurity standards, ensuring U.S. Cyber Command has the proper authorities and personnel, and coordinating cybersecurity efforts with related disciplines. So with that, again, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank Chairman McKeon and Ranking Member Smith and their tireless committee staff for their efforts, and I urge my colleagues to support swift passage of this crucial legislation. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague, a member of the Armed Services Committee, the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wolodarski.
Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this National Defense Authorization Act. This year's act includes historic reforms to address the growing epidemic of military sexual assault that is shamefully tarnishing the reputation of our armed forces. I want to thank Representative Loretta Sanchez for assisting me with a bipartisan provision that extended whistleblower protections to victims to ensure they cannot be retaliated against for reporting sexual assault. This common-sense measure will create an environment for safe reporting and encourage victims to come forward without fear of retribution from within their own ranks. Passing this NDAA with these critical reforms is a step in the right direction toward eradicating the horrific problem of military sexual trauma in the military. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, quickly sign it into law, so our service members have whistleblower protection. And I urge my colleagues to vote for this NDAA. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute now to the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa.
Gentlelady from Hawaii is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you to the gentleman from Washington. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this bipartisan legislation. The NDAA has been approved with bipartisan support for 51 consecutive years, so I'm pleased our committee was able to reach an agreement. The bill includes over $400 million in important funding for military construction in the state of Hawaii that will solidify our position in support of the Asia-Pacific rebalance. As you know, Hawaii is America's gateway to the Asia-Pacific. I would like to thank the Chair and Ranking Member for working with me to include critical provisions for Hawaii, and thank my bipartisan colleagues on the committee for helping me authorize new money for the Maritime Guarantee Loan Program, which will be used to preserve national security and ensure the long-term viability of the American maritime industry. I am pleased that the bill includes language that will help further critical research objectives in Hawaii for the Office of Naval Research from organizations like the Pacific International Center for High Technology Research. This will allow Hawaii to thrive into the future. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work on this year's bill, and I call upon my colleagues to vote for this important legislation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to the remaining time?
Gentleman has 2.5 minutes remaining.
And
the other side has 5.5 minutes remaining.
I'll be the concluding speaker here, so we'll reserve our time.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Barber, member of the committee.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan National Defense Authorization Act. And I call attention to a provision in the Act that will preserve the A-10, a core component of our nation's combat power and military readiness. This is a national security asset that I've been fighting for since even before I became a member of Congress, when I was Congresswoman Gifford's District Military Affairs lead. This National Defense Authorization Act states that the Air Force will not be allowed to retire, prepare to retire or place in storage any additional A-10 aircraft during 2014. A-10 pilots are trained at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, to fly a plane that is unsurpassed in its ability to provide support for our troops on the ground. In today's military environment, the A-10 is best suited to continue this very important mission for decades to come. We simply cannot adequately support the warfighter to continue on the ground if we get rid of this proven aircraft. I'm proud to support the NDAA, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Continue to
Reserves.
reserve.
Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you. We are down to our last speaker as well, so I will close on our side, and then the chairman has the right to close the debate. So I yield myself, which is a long way of saying I yield myself the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 4.5 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to take a quick minute again to thank all the people who worked to make this possible. Excuse me, our staffs on the Armed Services Committee in particular, both bipartisan, majority, minority, all have done an amazing job over a long period of time. And I really want to thank the chairman as well for his determination to get this bill done. It's never the same path twice, which always makes it interesting. But the one thing that we have very much in common is an absolute determination to get the bill done, for the reasons that the chairman and I stated earlier, because of just how important it is that we do our work and that we make sure that we provide for the troops who are serving us. But we could not do it without the incredible expertise and tireless work of our staffs. I particularly want to thank my staff director, Paul Arcangeli, for pulling all of this together as we bounced back and forth between whether or not we were going to do a formal conference or have to do this. That work that they've been doing over the last several months was critical in making this possible. And again, I will close just emphasizing the two big points. We need to do our work as Congress because people depend on it. They depend on the United States government functioning. Passing the National Defense Authorizing Act is a critical piece of that. So that we can continue to provide for the common defense as we are constitutionally mandated to do, and I urge everybody to support it. But every little bit as important is the budget agreement that's coming up later on. We have all, to some degree, on the Armed Services Committee and many elsewhere, railed against sequestration. The vote that's coming up this afternoon is not a choice between this budget agreement and what each one of us individually would like. It is a choice between the budget agreement and sequestration, a CR, and further threats of government shutdown. And I will just emphasize that the impact that that would have on the Department of Defense and its ability to do the job that we're asking them to do would be devastating. Now, I know we've heard everyone claim that sequestration was going to be this big deal, and it happened, and the sun came up the next morning, and everything was fine. Well, look. Two things about that. Number one, it had a profound impact on a lot of people. Not everybody, to be sure, but it did have that profound impact. And the second big point is it gets worse. The first year was tough, but there was uncosted balances, there was things you could do. They've kind of been running on fumes for a while, and if we continue sequestration, those fumes run out. And the cuts will be devastating, and we will not be able to do what it is that I think we need to do to provide for our national security, which isn't to say that the defense budget can't be cut. It's being cut, and it's going to be cut. But there are cuts, and then there are the nonsensical cuts of sequestration, and the only way out of that right now is the budget agreement. And lastly, I'll say that applies to a lot of other aspects of government. Transportation, housing, Head Start. We've heard all the stories about the devastating impact of sequestration on all those programs. Later this afternoon, we'll have our first real opportunity to reverse that. It is critically important that we do so. With that, I will simply urge passage of the National Defense Authorizing Act. Again, thank the chairman. I very much value our partnership. You know, given the desire for bipartisanship out there today, people are always asking me, well, do you have any Republicans that you work with? And I do. The chairman of our committee, who's done a great job in that capacity, and I very much value our friendship and our partnership, and hopefully we'll get the Senate to get this done, and we'll make it 52 years in a row. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
2.5 minutes.
I would yield myself the balance of time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized.
I want to thank the other committees who worked closely with us all year and members of the Armed Services Committee once again. Especially I want to thank our staff directors, Bob Simmons and Paul Arcangeli. They have worked tirelessly, as of all of these other people that have been putting in countless hours to get us to this point. This legislation addresses a wide array of policy issues, including supporting operations in Afghanistan, strengthening our partnerships in the Middle East, reinforcing our capabilities in the Pacific, combating sexual assault in the military, enhancing missile defense, and maintaining this nation's nuclear deterrent. Though the significant cuts to the defense budget continue to have a profound effect on readiness, our modernization programs, and the defense industrial base, the bill adequately sustains training, critical assembly lines, shipyards, manufacturing expertise to keep our wartime military properly prepared, equipped, and supplied. Each of these efforts is important for the security of our homeland and our allies. We've worked on a bicameral, bipartisan basis to get this legislation done. It's my sincere hope that we can continue working together to limit the damage to our military and their readiness resulting from sequestration. What we're considering here today is a step in the right direction. It's a solid product, thoroughly debated and deliberately considered. And I urge my colleagues to support and vote in favor of this legislation. You know, as Adam said, we have a great partnership. I think the thing that makes our committee work so well together is it's not about jobs. You know, sometimes people say, well, we just have a defense so that we can provide jobs. We have a defense because the Constitution says that we provide for the common defense. We have to be kind of the ones that keep the sea lanes open, the skies free, this nation free from terrorism. And I talked to General Odierno, Chief of our Army, last week, and he said in 2008 the budget for the U.S. Army was $250 billion. This year it's $150 billion. For people that say that we're really not cutting, we're just slowing the growth rate, we are cutting. And the thing that's been most affected is our readiness, and that is what causes lives to be lost, because our troops aren't getting sufficiently trained before they go to Afghanistan, before they go into harm's way. And this budget will help, as I talked to General Dempsey yesterday, this will help them get back on our feet in readiness. I want to thank Adam for his true friendship and partnership. I encourage all of our colleagues to vote for this bill to sustain the efforts of those who are willing to put themselves in harm's way to protect us. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 441? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules...
I request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on the motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3695 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3695, a bill to provide a temporary extension of the Food Conservation and Energy Act of 2008 and amendments made by that act, as previously extended and amended with certain additional modifications and exceptions, to suspend permanent price support authorities and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Costa. Each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on the bill H.R. 3695.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 3695, which provides a temporary extension of the 2008 Farm Bill. I believe this short-term extension provides certainty to everyone going into the new year that permanent law will not be triggered while the conference committee continues its work on a new bill. We're making significant progress in our negotiations with the Senate, and I'm confident we'll be able to finish the conference report in January. In the meantime, the reality is that unless we act today, permanent law takes effect January 1. The press headlines already speak of doom, that we're on the brink of going off the dairy cliff. Time magazine says, and I quote, "People are freaking out about $8 a gallon milk," unquote. And there's widespread speculation about what will happen and when exactly. It's not necessary to have that kind of panic throughout the country for producers and consumers, especially around the holidays. This bill makes clear what will happen on January 1, and passing it is the responsible action to take given the legislative calendar. Furthermore, we're not breaking any new ground. The 2002 Farm Bill was extended 6 times before the 2008 Farm Bill was enacted. Mr. Speaker, I urge and encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this short-term extension of the Farm Bill. And I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
And I rise in opposition to this bill. First of all, I want to thank Chairman Lucas, the gentleman from Oklahoma, for all the work that he has done over the years and the appreciation for his efforts in the past few years. It's taken a long time to get here, and certainly he has worked very hard to produce a 5-year farm bill. That said, the bill is not needed, and let me tell you why. The Chairman Lucas and Ranking Member Peterson have been working diligently, as I said, with their Senate counterparts, and the Conference Committee has reached an agreement on many of the issues, leaving a few remaining issues to be worked out, and we're doing that right now. Secretary Vilsack, Secretary of Agriculture, has also indicated that should we complete the Farm Bill in January, as we are talking about, that there should not be any problems regarding the potential impacts of the dairy title being implemented, and therefore those impacts of the cost of milk being felt by our consumers. Extending the current programs through the end of January, which is what this bill does, when it looks like we will be able to vote on a 5-year farm bill early next year, therefore is not necessary. Farmers, ranchers, dairy producers need the certainty of a 5-year farm bill. I think we all agree on that. Families, those in need, who depend upon the nutrition programs as part of our nation's safety net, need a 5-year farm bill. American consumers, those who we produce the food for, and those around the world know that they can depend upon our farmers, our ranchers, and our dairy producers to continue providing the safest and most affordable food in the world. Mr. Speaker, therefore, this measure is not needed. I urge my colleagues to vote no on H.R. 3695 and support a 5-year farm bill, which we will vote on early in January when we work the remaining differences in the conference committee. I yield back the balance of my time.
Does the gentleman yield back, or does the gentleman reserve?
I reserve.
Gentleman reserve. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Speaker, if I would note to my colleague, I have a couple of thoughts myself, and I would conclude with that. So if he has anything else he'd like to address.
I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time to myself.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is,
I yield to myself.
Chair stands corrected. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just simply to note to all my colleagues, my friend from California is exactly right. The importance of completing this cannot be overstated. The progress we've made certainly has been incredible, and we're on the verge. I would just simply note to all of my colleagues, as I've advocated caution and responsibility throughout this entire process, this is an opportunity for members to cast a vote to acknowledge to the folks back home that no matter what happens in the negotiations process, we will not have a dairy cliff. We will not have uncertainty for producers and ultimately the American consumers. Each member of this body is challenged to do what they think is wise. I would simply say to my colleagues, pass the extension, take care of business, and we on the Ag Committee will take care of our business in January. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3695 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1447, the Death in Custody Reporting Act of 2013.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 205, H.R. 1447, a bill to encourage states to report to the Attorney General certain information regarding the deaths of individuals in the custody of law enforcement agencies and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days with which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials in H.R. 1447 currently under consideration.
Without objection?
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
The Death in Custody Reporting Act of 2000 directed the Bureau of Justice Statistics within the Department of Justice to collect data on the deaths that occur at 2 important stages in the criminal justice system. First, deaths that occur in the process of arrest or during the transfer after arrest, and second, deaths that occur in jails and prisons. The provision of that act expired in December 2006. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 885 inmates died in the custody of local jails in 2011. This is the lowest number of jail inmate deaths in a 12-year history of deaths in the custody reporting program. Nearly 9 out of 10 state prisoner deaths were the result of natural causes, the leading reason being cancer and heart disease. Although illness-related deaths have increased slightly in recent years, the homicide and suicide rates in state prisons have dramatically decreased over the last 25 years. H.R. 1447 reauthorizes this data collection program and directs the Attorney General not only to collect the data, but also to study the data to determine how to reduce deaths in custody in the future. The legislation extends the reporting requirements to deaths that occur in federal custody. Although the Death in Custody Reporting Act expired in 2006, the Bureau of Justice Statistics has continued to collect this data. They provide a national resource for understanding mortality in the criminal justice system, and the collection of this data will help the federal, state, and local governments examine the relationships between deaths in custody and the proper management of jail and prison facilities. It will also provide important information to Congress on any need to improve federal custody procedures. Because the Bureau of Justice Statistics has continued to collect the information, even though the prior law has expired, this bill will not impose any new cost on the agency. Congress passed similar legislation in 3 Congresses with overwhelming bipartisan support. I'd like to thank Congressman Scott for introducing this legislation, and I would urge all my colleagues to support it. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise in support of H.R. 1447, the Death in Custody Reporting Act of 2013. This bill will require states and federal law enforcement agencies to report to the Department of Justice information about the deaths of individuals in their custody. We have learned from history how useful this information can be. In the 1980s, there was increased focus on conditions in state and local jails and prisons and the problem of prisoners dying in custody. The interest and oversight of this issue was generated partially because of the rise of wrongful death cases brought in relation to these deaths. Press reports in the 1990s concerning prison abuses and deaths of those incarcerated being attributed to suicide led Congress to develop legislation in response to this problem. The Deaths in Custody Reporting Act of 2000 was enacted to require states to report quarterly to the Attorney General information regarding the death of any person in the process of arrest or who is otherwise in custody, including jails, prisons, and juvenile facilities. The reports are brief, essentially stating who died and a brief description of what happened. The law expired in 2006, which led to an effort to reauthorize substantially the same requirements on states and extend those requirements to the federal agencies as well. And that's what H.R. 1447 would do. With this statistical data, policymakers at the state, local, and federal levels can make informed judgments about the appropriate treatment of prisoners and to develop ways to lower the prison death rate. This policy cannot be made if we don't have this information that the law requires. In fact, since the focus on deaths in custody emerged in the 1980s and enactment of the law in 2000, reports showed significant declines in suicides and homicides for those in custody. H.R. 1447 is a strong reaffirmation of the importance of requiring that states submit this information, and the bill expands the commitment to federal law enforcement agencies as well. The bill also requires the Attorney General to study the information the Justice Department receives and to issue a report to include a discussion of how the data may be used to reduce preventable deaths. With the enactment of this legislation, we can make even more progress with respect to reducing preventable deaths of those in custody, which is surely an obligation of government when it incarcerates so many of its citizens. This initiative has a history of strong bipartisan support, and I thank my colleagues from the other side of the aisle, especially the gentleman from Georgia, and my colleague from Virginia, the Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte, for supporting the bill in committee and bringing it to the floor today. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Georgia.
Does the gentleman have a speaker?
Yes, I have one additional speaker.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the ranking member of the subcommittee, and I thank the manager and as well the full committee chairperson and the ranking member of the full committee. I think it would not be inappropriate to acknowledge that many of us are gathered in the Judiciary Committee to wish Congressman Mel Watt well, and I will do so on the floor of the House. I am supporting this bill and again offer my appreciation for the Crime Subcommittee's bipartisan effort to look into our problem with criminalization at the start of the Congress. But I am concerned that there are a number of issues that were not discussed, but that this particular legislation is an important step, which I know that Mr. Scott has worked on quite extensively. The bill before us today works to, in essence, requires states that receive certain criminal justice assistance grants to report to the Attorney General on a quarterly basis certain information regarding the death of any person who is detained, arrested, en route to incarceration, or incarcerated in state or local facilities or a boot camp. H.R. 1447 also imposes penalties on states that fail to comply with such reporting requirements. The bill also requires the head of each federal law enforcement agency to report to the Attorney General annually certain information regarding the death of any person. My focus is to indicate that this is a practical initiative. I personally know that in jurisdictions in Texas, we have had incidences where individuals have gone into the county jail for minimal violations of the law and came out in a body bag. It happened to a mother of 2 sons who lost her life because an infected knee was not taken care of, or individuals who were ill, individuals who succumbed to inappropriate behavior by those who had charge over them. Has happened in jails and prisons across America. This is a life-saving initiative because many people will acknowledge that if you're incarcerated, even if you are there, as in our county jails, before you are convicted, certainly we recognize the criminal justice system, but it does not mean that you should lose your life. However, as we come to the end of this first year of the 113th Congress, I know my colleagues would recognize as well that we are experiencing 1 year of the tragic incidents that occurred at Sandy Hook. There will be those who will be mourning this afternoon, holding a memorial to acknowledge the tragedy of the lives lost. In this Congress, to our dismay, we've not been able to pass the universal background checks, which could readily be on the floor of the House and be of value to those mourning mothers and fathers who now mourn 1 year later and ask the question, why? In addition, we have seen over the last year in many of our jurisdictions the excessive violence that has taken up our young people through gun violence, through gangs and other actions that would welcome this Congress exercising its authority on issues dealing with anti-violence, anti-bullying, of course, and again, the ceasing of gun violence. I look forward to establishing a commission in my community responding to the incidences of 19 individuals being shot and 2 teenagers being killed, a young man from Jack Yates High School being killed, and another young man shot in a park. And so as I rise to support this legislation, I would simply argue as we move forward on this legislation that there's work to be done, and I hope we can join together in a bipartisan manner to do so. I hope my colleagues will vote and support H.R. 1447. I yield back.
Time, gentlelady, has expired. Gentleman from Georgia.
We have no other speakers. Are you ready to close?
I'm ready, prepared to close.
Gentleman from Virginia.
Yield myself such time as they may consume. Just to thank the gentlelady from Texas for her statement, the gentleman from Georgia, the chair of the committee, Mr. Goodlatte, and the ranking member, the lead co-sponsor on the legislation, Mr. Conyers, for their work. This is an important bill. We can use this information, and I want to thank again all of those that made today possible. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to take and close up here. Thank Congressman Scott for your passion and for working hard on this, and for Congresswoman Lee from Texas. This is a good way, especially for our Judiciary Committee, to come to an end on something we can agree upon that is a good thing, and I do appreciate being an opportunity to be here. I would encourage all of my colleagues to support this as a fine piece of legislation, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back. All time has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1447? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 of those present having voted in affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Mr. Engel? Yes. Thank you.
We good to go?
Okay.
For what purpose, gentleman from California, rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass House Resolution 3509 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3509, a bill to direct the Secretary of State to submit to Congress a report on the status of post-earthquake recovery and development efforts in Haiti.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, each will control 20 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to ask that members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material in the measure, on this measure, if I could ask for that by unanimous consent.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to yield my time, myself such time as I might consume, and just share with the members here that on January 12th of 2010, there was a massive earthquake that struck near the Haitian capital of Port-au-Prince. It left some 220,000 people dead. 1.5 million people were displaced. And since 2010, the United States has made a big commitment in humanitarian relief, a big commitment on reconstruction and development assistance in Haiti. And a good bit of this was allocated to the U.S. Agency for International Development to support an ambitious recovery plan that included housing and it included industrial development. Last summer, the House Foreign Affairs Committee received a GAO report detailing a startling lack of progress on U.S.-funded reconstruction efforts in Haiti. The committee followed up by sending a bipartisan delegation of staff to investigate, and then held an oversight hearing on Haiti reconstruction, where members asked tough questions about U.S. aid efforts. One recommendation we heard over and over was that Congress needs improved and more frequent reporting to ensure that we're being kept up to date on reconstruction activities, and so that Congress can provide tough oversight at a time when much of the funding for Haiti has yet to be spent. Wasted taxpayer dollars is simply unacceptable here. While we can help, Haitians must do better. As Haiti Special Coordinator Thomas Adams noted in his testimony before the committee, the key to sustainable improvement in Haiti lies not in the generosity of donors, but rather in the creation of economic opportunity in Haiti. I agree wholeheartedly with the Special Coordinator, but unfortunately Haiti currently lacks a clear and enforceable system of property rights, including effective property registry and titling, and struggles with high levels of corruption. These are serious problems which deter the kind of private sector investment that is the real future of Haiti's economy. Without significant improvements to Haiti's business climate, no amount of donor assistance is going to help. We need to work with the Haitian government to improve transparency, rule of law, and democracy so that we can in turn improve the lives and economic well-being of the country's citizens. Mr. Speaker, I want to commend Representative Barbara Lee, the author of this bill, who worked with Ranking Member Engel, Chairman Ross-Leitonen, and Chairman Salmon to craft this strong bipartisan oversight legislation that will improve relief efforts. And I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I'm going to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 20 minutes.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 3509, the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act of 2013. I'd like to begin by thanking my friend and colleague, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee, for introducing this important legislation. The Haitian people are lucky to have a friend with her vision and tenacity. It is difficult to overstate the devastation wrought by the 2010 earthquake in Haiti that gave rise to the multinational assistance effort. 316,000 people dead. That's just unbelievable, including 103 United States citizens, 101 United Nations personnel, and nearly 18% of the nation's civil service, as well as 300,000 injured, 115,000 homes destroyed, and 2 million people displaced. An estimated 15% of the population of Haiti was directly affected by the disaster and related damages. I traveled to Port-au-Prince, Haiti, shortly after the quake, and I can attest to the fact that even those horrific statistics do not fully describe the waste and destruction I saw. The United States quickly responded to the devastation in Haiti and responded robustly. In fact, the Post-Earthquake Assistance Program remains today among our most important foreign assistance commitments worldwide. Which brings me to the bipartisan legislation before us. H.R. 3509 should be understood as the culminating step in the ongoing oversight work of the Foreign Affairs Committee regarding that assistance plan. A multi-year and multi-billion-dollar commitment reflecting the compassion and generosity of the American people calls for ongoing vigilance, both in terms of accountability as well as policy direction. Our committee commissioned a GAO report on that assistance, which found, among other things, that the administration was not providing sufficient information to the Congress to fulfill our oversight role. We also sent a bipartisan staff delegation to look into specific problems GAO found and held a full committee hearing on the matter. H.R. 3509 is a logical next step. It seeks to fill the information gap by requiring the State Department to report on various aspects of our assistance program. It also includes a statement of policy that articulates the direction we think that assistance program should take. I believe that H.R. 3509 goes a significant way to achieve that goal. As I seem to do frequently in our committee and on the floor these days, I'd like to once again thank Chairman Royce and his wonderful staff for working in a truly bipartisan manner on this bill. It is genuinely appreciated by me and all of my Democratic colleagues on our committee. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Chair understands that the gentleman from California reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York.
Yes, I yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. First, let me thank Chairman Royce for your tremendous leadership and for your continued support and true effort to create bipartisan initiatives and legislation from your committee. I served with you on the committee for many, many years, and it's very consistent still in terms of trying to reach some bipartisan agreement on these bills. Thank you again so much. And of course to our ranking member, Mr. Engel, thank you again for your leadership and for helping craft a bill that we could get to the floor that is a bill that I think will really put the United States on the right side of history as it relates to Haiti, and also for your focus on the Western Hemisphere. Thank you so much. Let me also just reference and thank all of our original co-sponsors of the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act of 2013, including Representatives Yvette Clarke, Frederica Wilson, Maxine Waters, John Conyers, Charlie Rangel, Gregory Meeks, Karen Bass, and of course Ileana Ross-Layton. I want to thank my colleague Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee for staying strong and steady in supporting this legislation, and for all of their tireless work and longstanding commitment to the well-being of Haitians and the country of Haiti. Nearly 4 years ago, I stood as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and led a special order recognizing the importance of our relationship with Haiti. A short time later, I led a delegation to Haiti, and we witnessed firsthand the destruction and devastation firsthand. The Congressional Black Caucus has a long history of working with the Haitian people and the Haitian American community on a variety of issues. We share a close and long-standing relationship, and this has continued under the magnificent leadership of our current Chairwoman Marcia Fudge. On January 12, 2010, a devastating 7.0 earthquake struck near Haiti's capital. This terrible earthquake killed hundreds of thousands and left 1 million more homeless. Our government, the American people, and the international community responded with a tremendous outpouring of support for the Haitian people. However, what began as a swift and effective relief effort gave way to a sluggish reconstruction. A report by, and Chairman Roy cited this, by the Government Accountability Office found that USAID has missed a number of its own goals and deadlines. Most importantly, the GAO found that as of June 2013, USAID had committed only 52% and dispersed 35% of the $651 million in funding for earthquake reconstruction. That is why passing the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act of 2013 is so important. With so much money yet to be dispersed, we have an opportunity to ensure that our assistance is as effective as possible. My bill helps us understand where our aid efforts stand, where they are going, and how USAID plans to get there. It would require the State Department to report on the progress of infrastructure projects, indicators used to measure project success, efforts to combat corruption, measures taken to strengthen Haitian capacity, and considerations of vulnerable populations. My bill would give us the information we need to make those assessments and help get the reconstruction on track. No one is saying that this will be easy. The road to recovery is a long one, and this legislation is but one small step. We must also keep in mind that USAID cannot fix the problem on its own. I commend the agency for the work it does around the world and encourage it to continue to address the challenges it faces in Haiti. Haitian citizens and their government, along with non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations, must do their part. The Haitian government will need to hold free, fair, and timely elections. And I commend them for the steps they have already taken this week to hold long overdue elections next year. The United Nations will also need to vigorously address the cholera epidemic. There is no question that in October 2010, after nearly a century, not having cases in the country for over a century, the cholera was, as reported, it was introduced by UN peacekeepers. As I said before, I'm very proud that today we are voting to increase the transparency and accountability of U.S. assistance to Haiti on a bipartisan basis. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation. I look forward to continuing to work with them to ensure that Haiti is truly built back and that the Haitian people, once and for all, have a future, and that future will be ensured by the support of the American people. May I have another 30 seconds?
Yield the lady one. Gentlelady recognized an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I just want to thank our staff, Chairman Royce's staff, Chairman Engel's staff, and I want to especially thank my staff, Pablo and Gerard, and all of our staffs here for their very diligent and steadfast work. This has taken us probably about 4 years to get this bill to the floor, and so thank you again, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and all of the original co-sponsors for their tremendous support.
Time the gentlelady's expired. Gentleman from New York.
Yes, it's my pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from New York, Yvette Clark.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the gentlelady from California for yielding time for me to speak in support of H.R. 3509, the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act. As a representative of the second largest population of first and second generation Haitian Americans and Haitian immigrants, I appreciate the importance of the bill. It is critical that we expand communication between the executive branch and Congress to keep track of all monetary aid sent to Haiti, ensuring increased accountability and transparency. After the alarming findings of the GAO report, and since January 2010 earthquake, Haitians still live in IDP camps. They continue to fight the cholera epidemic. And with the Haitian government's very evident challenges in maintaining a sustainable democracy, it is imperative that Congress has all the information necessary to ensure that the U.S. foreign aid is being administered effectively. Mr. Speaker, as we look to the 4th anniversary of the horrific earthquake, I am hopeful of the day when we can witness the full recovery and rebirth of the beautiful Caribbean nation of Haiti. But until then, we have a lot of work to do. And that is why I encourage my colleagues to vote in favor of H.R. 3509, the Assessing Progress in Haiti Act. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New York.
I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Let me thank the ranking member and the chairman of the full committee for their leadership, but also for the bipartisan leadership that is noted on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the privilege that I had to serve some years ago when we worked on a number of issues, let me add my appreciation to the Congresswoman from California, Barbara Lee, who led us during her tenure as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus during enormous crisis in Haiti. But more importantly, as a supporter of this legislation and efforts to see Haiti move into a new era of democracy and reconstruction, this legislation, H.R. 3509, is long overdue, and I ask my colleagues to enthusiastically support it. I've traveled to Haiti on any number of occasions, visiting those who are incarcerated in jails, even after the earthquake, to find individuals who were suffering, who had been incarcerated, seeing people who had lost enormously their place to live, children who were out of school, and resources that were looking to be directed, but possibly, Mr. Speaker, not being directed as they should. This legislation, of course, will do several things. It will require a thorough assessment of the progress in meeting the original goals expressed in January 2011 post-earthquake U.S. government Haiti strategy, provide a description of efforts to combat corruption and ensure public accountability, and assess whether or not vulnerable populations have been taken into account in the design and implementation of the new programs. It is very important to note, as much work that has been done between the efforts of the international community, including the USAID, up to 3,000 people still live in tent camps, many of whom are facing forced evictions as time moves on. Cholera has killed over 8,400 Haitians and sickened over 689,400 since the time of this earthquake. Hundreds of thousands of Haitians have little or no access to potable water or basic health services, and Haiti is facing an impending food crisis according to local and international organizations. Can I have an additional minute?
I yield the gentlewoman an additional minute.
So H.R. 3509, I believe, will be an important step to gather all of those who are of good intentions, even our aid, particular aid offerer, the USAID, to be able to assess where we are, to be able to not only help but feel the pain of those who have not been helped. And I believe that it will be enormously important to look again at infrastructure, as it has impacted Port-au-Prince, but then as it has impacted the outer areas, which I think this legislation will be very helpful to. Again, it is bipartisan. We ask that this legislation be passed quickly in the Senate, and more importantly, that the President sign it to save lives. Finally, we wish for a democratic transition in democratic elections as Haiti goes forward in its elections. Let's hope whatever government is put in place, they will look to be able to give that lifeline that this legislation is talking about to move Haiti forward in the 21st century. And I ask my colleagues to support the legislation, and I thank Congresswoman Barbara Lee for her leadership.
Time, gentlelady, has expired. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further people to speak. I would just like to close our side.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we can all hear from the discussion here this afternoon, this is a very, very important bill and a very, very much needed bill. In the United States, we are the most generous people in the world, and we need to give help to this island which has been so devastated, which is really very near us geographically, and where we have many, many ties, particularly now with a burgeoning Haitian American population as well. This is humanitarian. This is really what's right. This personifies and I think typifies the good intentions of this Congress and of our nation. I'm proud to play a part of this. I want to again thank Barbara Lee for all her hard work, and thank Chairman Royce for, as we always say, bipartisan effort. This is truly bipartisan and truly something of which we can all be proud. I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just in closing, let me point out again the fact that we have a very strong bipartisan coalition of members that have worked a long time on this issue of trying to forge a focus on repair in Haiti. And we thank them for their efforts on the reconstruction. It's important for the people of Haiti to know that our efforts are best being used to help get them on solid ground, to help them get the foundation they need to move forward. And it's also important for those in the United States to feel that their money is being spent wisely and efficiently. And I think that's the intent, those two intents behind this legislation, H.R. 3509. It extends and strengthens, I think, the critical oversight that we do in the committee over Haitian funding, and it promotes the holding of free, fair, and timely elections in Haiti. And I want to thank the gentle lady from California, Congresswoman Lee, for her perseverance in getting this bill to the floor today. And I want to encourage my colleagues to support it, and I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Engel of New York, also for his efforts to bring this bill up today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairman yields back. All time for debate has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3509? Those in favor say aye. 3509 is amended. Those in favor say aye.